probably been about a year or so, and it's a pleasure to be back here. I've been here a few times over the past probably 11 or 12 years or so, and well, it's always good to come back up here and worship with you. It's been a blessing to be a part of this service. Now, normally, I don't ask people to bounce around the Bible with me. I like to focus in an area, but I want to jump over with you to Psalm 151. All right, go ahead, open your Bibles up to it. Let me know when you find it. I hear some struggles out there. 151. 151, yes. There's no 151, right? Well, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting about that. It's not my Bible either, and so I'm here with it on my phone. So Psalm 151 was part of the Septuagint. That is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But back when Jerome was translating the Vulgate in Latin, he elected to translate from the Hebrew Old Testament rather than the Greek Old Testament. And as a result of that, when you and I, most Protestants, Roman Catholics, our canonical Bibles, our Old Testament comes from the Masoretic Hebrew texts. But Orthodox Christians, the Orthodox churches, they use the Septuagint for their basis for the Old Testament. And so Roman Catholic and Protestant churches will not have a Psalm 151. However, if you had an Orthodox Bible in front of you and you opened up, you would find Psalm 151 there. Now, Psalm 151 was presumed to originally be written in Greek until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a scroll that was a combination. It had some of our canonical psalms, from our book of Psalms, but it had other psalms that were not part of our canon. And intriguingly, they found two different psalms that are now widely believed to be the basis for this Greek psalm. And this is the only psalm that we have, as far as I know, about the story of David and Goliath. And so I'm just going to read it very briefly here to you. It says, "I was small among my brothers, and the youngest in my father's house. I tended my father's sheep. My hands made a harp, my fingers fashioned a lyre. And who will tell my Lord? The Lord himself, it is he who hears. It was he who sent his messenger and took me from my father's sheep and anointed me with his anointing oil. My brothers were handsome and tall, but the Lord was not pleased with them. I went out to meet the Philistine, and he cursed me by his idols, but I drew his own sword. I beheaded him and took away disgrace from the people of Israel." So it's not part of our canon. It is part of canon for other Christian groups. And I thought it was interesting. I'm kind of a nerd for textual history, some of that stuff, and so I figured I would share that with you as what I ran into as I was studying this story about David. The story of David and Goliath is one of these, it's a classic story, isn't it? You don't even have to be a Christian and you understand the concept of David and Goliath. There's something about the underdog story that is so appealing. It just fits right in with our culture and becomes this cultural icon, whether you're a Christian or not. David and Goliath. As I read through the story of David and Goliath, I picked up a number of lessons. And so today I want to work through this story with you, and we're going to take out some lessons on how we battle giants. And so I encourage you, as we go through this, to think about the giants that you're battling in your own life, the giants that this church may be battling. I see an evangelistic series coming up. Evangelistic series can be giants, can't they? And so think about some of these, and with God's blessing, perhaps some of the lessons we talk about here will apply, and you'll find ways to apply these in your life, in your own battles, in the church, and in the church's battles. So we're going to go to 1 Samuel 17. I promise it is actually there. We're going to start right at verse 1. And we're going to see how the author here introduces us to this story. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. They were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah. All right, these names get hard here, don't they? We're just going to kind of move fast through some of them. Verse 2, Saul and the Israelites gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and formed ranks against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley in between them. Take a moment and just imagine this in your head. Just picture these two battles up on elevated terrain, looking across this valley at each other. Imagine for a moment if they started charging at each other and met in pitched battle in the middle of that valley, what that might look like. Verse 4, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath. All right, before I get into this description, I want you to just pay attention how much time and how many words the author puts into describing this giant and just how big he is. Scrolls were expensive. Scrolls had limited space. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this when you're reading stories in the Old Testament, that oftentimes there isn't very much detail given to you. The author is being concise and trying to stay focused. And so when there is detail, you want to pay attention, because the author is doing this on purpose. He's trying to get this idea to you. He's taking a valuable space to get an idea across to you. It says Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span, so something like 9 feet tall. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. Now, when we imagine really tall people, don't you generally imagine them being kind of skinny? You know, you don't see that many people that are, you don't see that many people that are 7 feet tall. But generally 7 foot tall people can be pretty skinny. This guy was not a skinny man. This was a huge guy. He wasn't just tall, he was strong. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." Verse 11, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. This is enormous. This is a big guy. This is a big guy beyond our imagination, to be honest with you. You saw this description there. You and I have never seen a person like this in our lives. Never seen someone 9 feet tall, big, strong, powerful. Nothing like this. Who can beat a giant like this? Now you might say, you know what, Greg, I remember reading earlier stories about when Saul became king. And you know what the Bible said about Saul? He was head and shoulders above everyone else. You could pick him out of a crowd instantly because Saul was a big guy. Saul is the logical choice when you look at it to go face the giant. He's the king, he's the leading warrior, and he's a big guy too. But who's afraid? Saul and the people of Israel. Everyone's terrified. It's very easy when we sit in the pulpit to assume that giant slaying belongs to the pastor. The giant slaying belongs to the church board, to the elders. That slaying the giant isn't my problem. I'm not a leader here. But understand that not every giant is intended for the leader to face. Sometimes the giant is one that you need to battle. And so here is this question. I started with it, I'm going to ask it again. What are the challenges? What are the giants that you're facing in your life? What are the giants that the Blythedale Church is facing? I know they're here. I know that you've got them. And so what do we do about them? Now that we have the setting, we have this giant. The story changes here, and it goes to a young man named David and his father Jesse. And it introduces us to David, which is a little bit interesting because, we find out about David in some previous chapters. But we get this reintroduction. David was at home tending sheep, and his three eldest brothers, David was the youngest, of course, his three eldest brothers were at war with the Philistines. They were out on that mountain looking across the valley at Goliath. And Jesse wants to know what's happening because Jesse loves his kids. And he's worried about what's happening with the battle. And so Jesse says, David, find someone to watch your sheep. I need you to take food. I need you to take some cheese to give to their commander. I need you to take some bread for them. Take all this stuff, find out what's happening to them. Bring me back word from your brothers. Verse 20. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. This is a bold kid, isn't he? You hear, the army is making the war cry. They're going out to the front lines. And what's David's immediate solution? Here, somebody take my food. I got to go see my brothers at the front line. If it were me, I probably would have said, you know what, I'm going to wait till this all settles down, and when they come back from the front lines, we'll have our conversation. But David just goes for it. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. All the Israelites, when they saw the man, fled from him and were very much afraid. The Israelites said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. The king will greatly enrich the man who kills him and will give him his daughter and make his family free in Israel. Now, if you remember this story from when you were a child and how it was told to you as a child, you'd think, okay, this is where David is offended that Goliath is speaking against the God of Israel. But you notice David's immediate response here is, David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? He's immediately asking, wait, what is it you get if you fight the giant? What is it you get for that? I kind of like that idea. The people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. David hears this, and he's fearless. In fact, the idea that you get something, you might get some wealth, you might get the king's daughter out of doing this actually appeals to him. Everyone else is terrified. They don't care what the king offers because they'll be dead. But David, he's fearless. He has shown zero fear from when this started, running to the front lines to see his brothers. And then he hears this giant, and his immediate thought is, well, I could take this guy. Meanwhile, everyone else is terrified, and Saul is bribing people, trying to bribe people to fight. David had focus. It would be very easy for David to have seen the giant and said, I could take that guy, but there's a whole army around him, and if I take the giant, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. David doesn't even think about that. He sees the problem. He sees the giant that he's facing. And here's one of the problems that happens when we start to fight giants. We put our focus on everything. And the problem is when you look at everything, you're going to be overwhelmed and you're not going to accomplish anything. You have to have focus if you're going to fight a giant. Focus on that giant. When you focus on everything, nothing will happen because it's overwhelming. So find focus. Additionally, fighting a giant requires vision. You have to be able to see that giant as a solvable problem. You have to have an idea of what it looks like when that giant is defeated. You have to have that vision. Because otherwise, if you can't envision it, your fear is going to overwhelm you. You need vision and you need focus. Don't look beyond that giant. Don't look around. You have a giant to fight. You can beat that giant. Focus on what it takes to defeat the giant. You have other people around you that can help you with the details after that giant is slain. It's not all on you. And likewise, they were terrified, but David had an army behind him as well. If he defeated the giant, the rest could fall into place. Verse 28, his eldest brother Eliab heard him talking to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. He said, why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down just to see the battle. David said, what have I done now? It was only a question. You can actually imagine this conversation between siblings, can't you? He turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. David keeps asking this question. So what do you get if you fight the giant? What's the deal here? And he keeps getting the same answer. He's being certain about this. Sorry, I just find this fascinating, pulling that thread. I don't have a major point with that thread watching David, but I just find it fascinating as I read these texts. So here's the thing. When you are optimistic about slaying a giant, you know what you're going to get? You're going to get people that are negative that say, no, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. Don't bother trying. You're not capable. You're not good enough. You don't have the skills. And maybe even you're a bad person for even bringing it up. Optimism results in negativity from other people. It's just the reality of it. And it's frustrating because some of you may be thinking about the people in your jobs or in your families where anytime you show optimism, well, they just get all negative on you. Motivated people are frequently broken by church negativity. Every so often, someone has an idea, they're enthusiastic about it, and they're ready to go. And the church, rather than saying, you know what, let's build off this enthusiasm, they say, nah, it's not going to work. Let's not do this. Let's make it hard. You can only do it if you do it this. And we crush them. Don't let negativity kill your motivation. If you want to fight a giant, you're going to hear some pushback. Keep that motivation. Additionally, flip this around. Don't be that person that is there killing someone else's motivation. If someone wants to try to fight that battle, my goodness, you support them. You be there with them. Let them try. Yeah, they might fail. That happens. That happens more often than we'd like to admit. But let them try. The only way we ever succeed is by actually making the effort. Fighting giants requires both optimism that you can do it and motivation, the desire, that feeling that you actually want to try. One of our greatest problems in our churches is a lack of motivation. Do you disagree with that? It's a struggle. And I think for a lot of us, when we look at our personal lives, we can say, you know, a lot of my problem is lack of motivation. Verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy. He's been a warrior from his youth. Goliath is like 9 feet tall. You remember that? This is a big guy. Imagine how big Goliath was at 12. He was probably bigger than I am now. This guy was a warrior from being a kid. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw and strike it down and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. David said, the Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. This fits in very much with what we just read before, just a little different. Saul comes back to him with, you can't win. You're too young. You're too little. Not going to work. Not going to happen. Let the inexperienced people try. Let the young people try. Oftentimes, the young people are the only ones that are willing to step outside the box and try something new. If we want our church to do things that are new, to find new ways to do things, you have to let the young people try. Now, it's going to fail sometimes. It'll blow up in their face. It'll blow up in the church's face. That'll happen sometimes. But we have to try. You see, the older we get, the more experience we build up. And one of the problems with experience, as valuable as it is that we learn all the things that we're not going to try again. But sometimes those things are worth trying again. Sometimes experience tells us that there are things that we haven't tried before, but they're not worth trying because my experience tells me that that's not going to play out. And pretty soon, once you have all this experience of things that don't work, you don't do anything. Because why bother? Nothing's ever going to work. Experience, for all its benefits, can create ruts in our lives and keep us from stepping out and trying something new, something different, something challenging. Experience tells us that the giant is going to squish us like a bug. But if we're going to fight a giant, we can't believe that. So when someone young says, hey, you know what, I'd like to take a stab at this. I'd like to take a shot at this. Let them try. Give them that shot. Let them go beyond the box and support them as much as you can every step of the way. Take advantage of the energy of youth. They might surprise you and accomplish something far bigger than you ever expected. And this is necessary because if you want to fight a giant, one of those giants that's been hanging around for a long time, you're going to have to try new things. You're going to have to do things a little differently. Maybe you'll try an old thing, but you're going to do it better this time. But the reality is you have to overcome all that experience to try it differently. That's why sometimes it's easier to let a young person take the lead when they show a willingness to do that. Verse 38, Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor and tried to walk in vain, for he was not used to them. This should be a little bit humorous. I think the author was aiming for this to be a little bit funny. Just imagine David putting on all this armor and then trying to walk, and he can't even walk. Are you kidding me? Then David said to Saul, I can't walk with these, for I am not used to them. So David removed them. Sometimes when you go to fight a giant, the armor that people tell you to put on just doesn't fit. David was not going to have a prayer fighting this battle with a sword and a shield and this armor. That's not where his strengths were. Maybe they would be there in the future, but that's not where they were this day. He was a shepherd boy. He didn't know what to do with all this stuff. When you fight giants, you can't fight giants someone else's way. You can't use someone else's strengths to fight the giant. If you're going to fight a giant, you have to use the strengths that God has given you. One time, the church that we attended a number of years ago, they like to have a booth in the commercial building at the Howard County Fair. And so Candy and I thought, great, we'll sign up for some slots to man that booth. We'll volunteer and help out. And so we showed up, and there were two of us that were going to be there with literature, and we're going to stand at the front, and as people walked by, we were going to offer them literature, try and engage them, and, no problem. It was one of those things that was outside of my comfort zone, but we were going to give this a shot. I'll tell you, it was going great. It seemed like everyone was coming from this direction, and the person next to me that was helping with this was on that side of me. He was grabbing everyone that came along. I mean, people would take anything from him. He was engaging them in conversation. I was really fascinated watching this. But I wasn't doing much because he was getting everyone. Well, he had to step away, use the restroom, do something for a few minutes, and so I was like, okay, well, I'll take over, no problem, we'll make this work. No one would take a thing from me. I couldn't engage anybody on anything. It was a complete waste of time, to be honest with you. It seemed like sometimes they're just backing away, and I don't know what I was doing wrong. And honestly, please don't guess. I'd rather not know what I was doing wrong at this point. But I learned through that process that is not one of my strengths. You hear people come up and, from the pulpit and say, you should be telling everyone in your neighborhood about Jesus. You know what? I'm going to tell you this right now. Me going and knocking on doors and saying, hey, have you heard about my faith, is not going to go well. I can tell you that right now, because that's not my strength. We've engaged with our neighbors before. We've even been blessed and had one neighbor that joined the Adventist church, but it wasn't because I knocked on her door and said, here, have this literature. I can't engage people that way. God did not give me that kind of strength. Now, you put me in front of a microphone and tell me to talk about a subject. I'm at home. I love doing this. I teach at a community college so I can public speak more often. But you want me to engage my faith directly with someone that I've never met before? That's not my gift. That's not my gift. I don't have that kind of charisma. And so I have to understand that I need to work off of my strengths when I'm going to fight a giant. The church doesn't need my weaknesses. The church needs the strengths that God has given me. And so I want you to think about that. It's very easy to look at our weaknesses and say, okay, I'm going to invest my energy into turning my weaknesses into strengths. I think that as tempting as that is, it's a little misguided. You need to ask yourself, what are your strengths? What are you good at? What are the gifts that God has given you? And take some of that energy that you were investing in trying to turn your weaknesses into strengths. Instead, work around your weaknesses and put that energy into making your strengths the next level. Olympic swimmers don't become Olympic swimmers because they looked at the things they weren't good at and said, you know what, let's do that instead. I'm going to practice that all the time. They invested in something that they showed skill for and put in enormous amounts of time and energy to make their strength world class. So, build on your strengths. You have strengths, I know it. You have strengths that you can use in the service of the church. So look at those strengths and say, how can I make this strength even better? How can I take this to the next level? The church needs your strengths. Don't let them just set to the side. And so David here, he's smart enough to know that he can't fight with someone else's strengths because it's not his strength. He's going to fight based on what God has given him, on what he is good at. So verse 40. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the creek and put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Now, notice here. How many stones does he get? 5. How many stones does he need? 1. So why did he get 5? It's very easy to look at this and say, well, that's a lack of faith. Don't say that. Don't say that. It is completely reasonable to work under the assumption that you might miss the first time, that you might miss the second time, that you might miss the third time, that you might miss the fourth time. Because we're not perfect. And the very act of trying is a growth process. There's plenty of stories in the Bible of people that did exactly what they were supposed to do, only for it to blow up in their faces, and they had to try again. And so don't assume that everything is going to go perfectly for you if you go fight that giant. You might miss. You might have to try again with a little better aim. You might miss a number of times. But if that giant's still there, you still have a job to do. David took the time to prepare, and he was prepared to fail multiple times and keep fighting. To properly fight a giant, you actually have to prepare. You have to put in the energy. You have to put in the thought. You have to ask, what if things go wrong? And be prepared for that as well. God's call requires preparation on our part. And God's call is no guarantee that we are going to have immediate success. Fighting giants requires us to prepare for the fight and to be okay with failure, at least in the short term. Verse 41, the Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And every time I read this, I find it fascinating that the author wants to make sure that we know that David is handsome. All right? The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field. Now notice exactly what the Philistine says to David and how David responds. But David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. You notice how he takes exactly what Goliath says and just flips it around. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. And this perhaps is the most important part. David speaks here of his true strength. It's not in his sling and his stones. It's not in his experience with bears and lions. The battle belongs to the Lord. And so if we are going to fight giants, beyond going through this list, we have to understand that the battle is not our battle. The battle is the Lord's. And so when we go into that battle, we can go in with confidence that whatever happens, it's ultimately in the hands of God. When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him. There was no sword in David's hand. David finishes the job, goes up, takes the giant's sword, and ends the day. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. David won the battle and told one of the most marvelous stories in Scripture. So here's the thing. If you want to fight giants like David did, here's what you need. You need to have vision. You need to be able to envision what it looks like if this giant is defeated. That vision has to overcome your fear. And you need focus. You need to be able to look at that giant and say, this is my battle. Don't worry about the things beside. You have other people in your life that can help you. Focus on your giant. Fighting giant requires optimism and motivation. If you're not motivated, you're not going to get very far in fighting your giant. You're going to stay at home and you're going to watch Netflix because you have a hard time getting up off your couch and doing something. You need that motivation. And when you see someone with that motivation, because we're not all motivated all the time, capitalize on it. Fighting giants requires trying new things, or perhaps doing a better job with the old things. But you're not going to do it doing the same thing the same way every time. Fighting giants requires you to fight your way based on your strengths, not on someone else's strengths. You work with the strengths that God has given you. Fighting giants requires us to prepare for the fight and to be okay with the possibility that this time around may be a swing and a miss. But we're going to be ready for next time and the time after until we win this battle for good. And then finally, if we're going to fight a giant, we have to remember that the battle isn't ours. The battle belongs to the Lord. And all the rest of this is simply God letting us be a participant in his battle. And that, my friends, is how you fight a giant. Our closing hymn today is number 618, Stand Up for Jesus.